I'm Bruce Linton, and you're listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh,
hello, listeners, and welcome to a very special edition of Professionally Cannabis. Today's episode is special for two reasons. Firstly, because of our guest, and secondly, because Oscar is alive. Now, typically, this isn't something that we celebrate on the podcast. Oscar, why am I particularly happy about this today?
Well, I think it's not unwise to celebrate my life every day, but in this particular instance, dear listener, on the way to record this episode, I was driving on my motorbike perfectly safely along an A road when some absolute tosser pulled out right in front of me, whacked me off, and sort of ground up my leg. I mean, it's not so bad, but I am sitting here in my pants with an ice pack on my ankle.
And for context, he is still sat in his pants in our studio. But that aside, Oscar, happy to have you still with us. Who was our guest today?
Well, if our listeners can allow the titillating thought of me sat here without trousers out of their mind, they might be interested to hear that we had the one, the only Bruce Linton, King of Canopy, on our very podcast. Johnny, for those who have been living under a rock, why is Bruce Linton such an impressive guest to have?
Well, in a nutshell, in the space of about 6 years, Bruce has built a company from the ground to become the largest cannabis company in the world earlier this year with a market cap of $20 billion. I think that's pretty impressive.
It sure is. And the man himself is too, so let's get on with it.
where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each
Today's
night?
guest is a man who needs no introduction, but we'll give him one anyway. Oscar and I are delighted to be joined by Bruce Linton, former CEO of Canopy Growth. Before leaving the company in July of this year, within 6 years, Bruce grew the organization from an idea based out of a chocolate factory to the largest cannabis company in the world in April 2019, with a market cap of $20 billion. Since then, he's been up to many things, but, well, better off hearing about it from the man himself. Bruce, a pleasure to have you join us on Professionally Cannabis.
Hey, nice to be here. Thanks for accommodating my technical glitches.
For Bruce Linton, we'd accommodate more than technical glitches.
Thank you.
So we like to lead with a question. Oh, I think I'm going to say lead twice here. Oh, well. But our typical question is, so Bruce Linton, and I'm going to keep saying your name because it's quite unimaginable that you're here on our podcast. What led you to the plant?
Sort of oddly, now when I kind of try to explain who I am for sort of a circumstance like this, I said, maybe I'm the guy that's the seed to the suit. and when I say that, it's intentional to elicit that kind of a little bit of a chuckle, because for the people on the inside, it's not to be to the suit. But kind of what brought me to it was a naive view that regulators actually wanted to regulate this properly in Canada. And that their point of regulating it wasn't as much about what the plant could do, but it was about the potential of embarrassment, in that if they didn't have companies or people organizing companies that would actually be very good at not losing it, at not sending it to the wrong patient, or not sending the wrong quantities, or being unable to actually govern their behavior so they didn't adulterate the plant. And so when I looked at that mismatch between what a bureaucrat wanted and what I thought the people who were going to do the businesses would be good at, I thought I should step in, because as somebody from tech, I'm really good at not losing things. And when I say that, if you're a customer of, say, British Telecom, and suppose you're a bank, and you run a trading platform with the London Stock Exchange, if you have a data company that's not good at keeping track of everything, the size of your transactions you make or the intent of them would be very different. And so I came from a sector where we were in charge of keeping track of data packets, which is relatively much harder than keeping tracks of grams of cannabis. So it was really, I would say, alignment of what I thought I was good at, what I thought the bureaucrats needed, and that began. Now, where do you end up? You evolve a lot, right? So I started there, and it didn't take me very long to become quite upset with bias, and I'll call it almost bigotry. People who would just say, I don't like it with no reason. And so I probably spent the last 6 years, as I've been explaining what's going on with the plant and the people around it, often I feel like I'm talking to, or picture, a very biased 74-year-old person who says, I really don't like it, and they have no reason to say because. And what I'm trying to do is have them conclude that they don't know enough about it to dislike it. In fact, they might like it if they open their mind, and possibly the reason their grandchild was misbehaving wasn't cannabis, but poor parenting by the children they had raised.
So I was intrigued when you called your first belief naive. What do you think has how has your view of the regulators changed over these 6 years? And what was your naive belief? And what is your jaded present one?
So there are really three actors that made me realize I'm a bit naive, in that almost none of the governance of cannabis globally initially, up until a couple of years ago, resulted from any political will. It was typically a court decision. So in Canada, there was no political decision that said we want to actually govern this properly. The courts had said you can't withhold a medical product from people, and this definitely has medical merit. In 2001, that argument succeeded, and the courts progressed through various decisions so that the regulators, the bureaucrats, were dragged in, but the politicians were still standing on the sideline. And so where I was naive was that I thought that there was possibly alignment between court decisions, bureaucratic obligations, and political recognition of how something was actually polling. People weren't opposed to regulating it. And so I'm starting to see politicians getting in front of what's already clearly more popular than ignoring cannabis. But where I was naive is I thought that there was, in fact, some alignment of all three principal actors in the public policy and the formation of decisions, when in fact it was courts dragging bureaucrats that ultimately got enough traction and society saw the merits of the approach that politicians finally jump in. And as politicians in all countries do, when they can see what direction the parade that has already formed is going, they immediately try to run to the front of it. And I think I've observed that quite actively in cannabis over the last 5 or 6 years.
And talking of politics and politicians, what is your view with regards to Canada today? So recently the Canadian election has taken place, and it looks like Trudeau is going to be forming a minority government. What do you think the implications and impact of this will have on the cannabis industry and Canada's future role in the cannabis industry?
Well, actually, I love the accent with which you asked that question, because I don't have to explain minority politics, nor do I have to explain a two-house system where the upper house may or may not be elected. Which, when you're in Canada, usually you're talking politics southward, and you spend a lot of time explaining that the only commonality between their Senate and our Senate is that they both generally have old people who are male who don't often work. But I think it was a really weird election, right? So they ended up with a minority government, and the single biggest economic development engine that occurred during their term, which was cannabis, was not a topic that any party spoke of. There was not a single party opposed to cannabis in this election, nor was there a single party actively in favor. And so I think what's going to happen now that they've had the election is politics are going to have to get a sharper point, and I think people are going to start to point to facts and data. Like if you look at the amount of foreign direct investment that's coming to Canada, I believe there's no other field which has attracted more capital than cannabis during the prior 4 or 5 years. If you look at job creation, more jobs created by cannabis companies. I know the data just from Canopy, we created more jobs in the last couple of years in Canada than guys like, Google and Amazon and major food processors combined. And the better part with the jobs that cannabis creates is they're not all in downtown tall office towers competing. They're almost always distributed across the country at points of production. And then you move lab people out there. So they're actually jobs where you need them rather than just jobs in a tower where they're indifferent. So I think what you're going to see is the politics are going to start to be a lot more aware of the fact that people want to hear what's near them so they can actually say that candidate or that party understands what I'm living with. And so I'm personally putting quite a heavy push for at least one or two of the parties to step up and own the fact that Canada is the best policy example on the planet, and they should mandate that if they were in power, they would have their bureaucrats and their diplomats dragging, like how often have senior officials been to Canada from NHS? How many and from what levels? Is the regulatory process and the guidance towards that, is there an ongoing active file between Health Canada and NHS? I don't think it's sufficient no matter what it is. And so I think that's the chance that we have after this election with, sort of the minority government has to figure out how to actually appeal more specifically.
So talking about Canada and its position in the world stage, I think a lot of people would perhaps view Canopy's and all the big Canadian LPs strategy as win Canada and then win the world of cannabis, because you look at the market capitalization and you see, obviously, these are designed to be international beasts. Do you still feel like whoever wins Canada will win the world, or could another regional winner emerge?
They could emerge, but that would be because an absence of execution, not because of an absence of lead or advantage. And any company that begins in Canada that actually wants to be successful has to take a position that they're very happy to be from Canada. They have to not stay in Canada. And, you know, I think it's very similar, right? Like, if you want to be a great dominant global business, can you stay and say, I only do business in London? No, you have to build capabilities, content, and brand and take it globally with acceleration. And so Canada has the window of opportunity to lose, but like, you know, Israel reluctantly and slowly moved to a decent governance model. They're pretty active on this, where I see, you know, the German market hasn't created a chance for companies very much yet, but I'm not sure that it will stay that way. The UK licensing scheme, it's going to create great research. And, you know, because they had GW in this sort of hidden off area, I think if they can sponsor 4 or 5 more companies that want to come from the UK and be better than GW, be more bold, there's a potential for that. The US has a bunch of entrepreneurs that are doing things, but they have such restricted capital and poor governance. It's probably the only time in our lifetimes that you'll have actually seen the US on the biggest new economy thing happening entirely disadvantage their entrepreneurs. You know, they're starting to talk about, should we disadvantage the entrepreneurs with big tech right now? Should we break up Facebook and Google? Those are funny questions. I suspect China's not asking, should they break up their big tech companies and disadvantage them? But as far as cannabis goes, they've not allowed anybody to become really substantial and successful because of their poor regulation. If that changes everything.
And keeping on the theme of the Canadian market, you know, it's no secret that the last few months has been testing and challenging. What do you think is the best way for some of the large cannabis companies that are out there to move forward? Do you think that firms are going to look to consolidate and optimize their current offerings and operations, or double down on international growth strategies, or perhaps look at M&A as a viable route to weather this storm?
Well, it depends whether or not you ask the accounting department, the science department, or the visionaries, if one exists. Because accounting will tell you cut spending and make a profit in tough times, no matter what it takes. And the science department will tell you that we've only begun. There's so little understood. We have so much of a future. We should triple our budget because we can probably get claims and IP and learn things now that the world hasn't figured out yet. When they all start chasing, it'll be too late because we're competing with the world. And if you ask somebody who's looking at where we are, this is such an early stage that I think if you have really sufficient capital, you should spend more aggressively than ever, because it is a capital constrained window, which has happened several times and always happens in sectors. But now you look at the categories and say, who has cash, who doesn't? And if you don't have cash, you better listen to the accounting department. If you do have cash, you better listen to vision. And when you do listen to vision, you would triple your spending on trying to make every form of category, from four-legged mammal to beverages to geriatric care to spending on what I'll call Cannabis 4.0, where you start looking at curative possibilities of rare cannabinoids and playing with stem cells. You would dump a lot of cash into all that, because essentially all that's happening right now with the tough capital markets is it means that some people are running a little low in their fuel tank, and they'll start driving a little more carefully, as you always do when you can tell that you're low on fuel. If your tank's full, put it to the floor, drive super hard, and I don't know, rip over everything, be my pitch.
And do you think that speaks to your separation from Canopy, I suppose? Because as far as I might understand it, your vision was that foot to the gas, let's get to Cannabis 4.0. But some shareholders were more in the let's get to profitability, let's pull our belts in and weather the storm.
Yeah, well, for sure. It was a fundamental accounting difference. There are two ways companies operate. One is the big established, no growth, but good margins company called earnings per share. And the only reason people buy your stock isn't because it's exciting, because it actually isn't. It yields them a dividend and or a certain small but continuous growth curve based on your profitability. The other is what tech and growth companies do, which is called adjusted EBITDA. And those companies, don't worry, you tell your shareholders, guys, we're not paying you, you're not going to make a lot tomorrow or the next day, but our intent is to make a huge win as we go forward. And you have to report to them how you're spending your money and why you're making progression. But when the granular part underneath is, if you're an earnings per share company, do you want to buy and own things? Gosh, no. That means you're spending cash, which could have gone to the shareholder. If you're an adjusted EBITDA company, you go and raise cash so you can spend stuff. So I suspect as Amazon was being built out, they didn't have a huge group out there looking, saying, how do I rent a data center? How do I rent software? They built it all, spent the money, and it's worked out okay for Amazon. So I think you just have to decide what kind of company you want to be. And ultimately, the kind of company I like is one which actually has ambition but measures it, isn't unbridled, right? If you're unbridled, we would have been bankrupt. Last I checked, when I left, there was about 3 or 4 billion in the bank. So when you have that kind of cash in the bank, and the reason I raised it was so that I could accelerate domination in a segment which was going to have other players, but I wanted to be so far ahead that there would be for sure some debate as to who's number 2 or 3, but there would be no debate who's number 1. And I suspect that mentality is because I spent a lot of time looking at and using as a proxy. When I was raising money for many years, I was explaining the earnings per share up and down and sometimes negative, but always growing the underlying business of Amazon. I used them as an explanation of how I was trying to build the company for probably 3 to 5 years.
And the Amazon reference is really pertinent at the moment, because actually myself and Oscar are recording this from a WeWork building who, there some commentators on the markets have drawn certain comparisons between WeWork and Amazon as well.
But just to pause you on that, here's the difference. WeWork, what happened? Their leader, what is he getting, $200 or $300 million if he'll leave? From SoftBank, the investor. Because what happens with some firms, like I'd say to an extent Uber, for sure WeWork, is they get pushed so full of venture capital that they get kind of higher and higher values, more and more money. And what happens is their intent then is to go onto an exchange list and find people dumb enough to buy their stock because it couldn't possibly go up for a long time, so it's going to kind of deflate. And I don't like that model. What I was trying to do is go public early, do 16 or 17 rounds of finance, and allow people to make a lot of money all the time, all the way up, and keep incrementing what you're doing so people watch the progression. What I find things like WeWork now and some of these ones, the progression's invisible to the general public because you might see more WeWork buildings, but you don't know really, other than being a customer, how could you have been involved with them? And when it finally shows up, what you do is you piss off your best customers because they buy the stock because they like the space, and the stock goes down to half, and they say, well, who can I get space for other than WeWork? And so I think my model was much more about how do you collaboratively create value with the public markets?
And I guess building from that, after your departure from Canopy Growth, you made headlines when you announced on CNBC that you bought more of the company's stock.
Well, there's a couple of things. So CNBC and a lot of earned media are worth participating in that when I was terminated, I could have disappeared, but instead I said that first morning. They called me because there was a press release, and I said, yeah, no, for sure I was terminated. That's why I was off at the Costco buying gas quite early this morning because I had free time. And, you want to get a deal. And so I let everybody know on that day that I liked the company. I liked me. I wasn't out of there because of any other reason than I might have been disagreeable, but it wasn't like, oh, he's been found, in the lunchroom with the wrong person and he's been stealing money and doing drugs on the lunch table. Nope, none of that went down. So yeah, so if you do something really bad and you get fired, you should probably hide under a rock. But if you didn't, why would you? And so then when I was doing things through the summer, and the summer's a quiet time for CNBC, so they'll talk to anybody if you're interested in business. I said, of course I'm buying more stock because it was falling quite a lot and I own quite a lot. And so if you believe in something, you should signal it to the market by saying, well, I haven't sold any at that time. I actually was buying it, which was almost completely contrarian to what most people would think somebody would do once they're fired. I left the company, but all the people that I hired didn't leave the company. All the communities we operate in didn't get the company out. So I really wanted to signal that it was a good place. I liked it. Please stop having the stock fall. And it was really ineffective, right? So I bought what I bought. Would have been enough if I liked it to buy a pretty posh car in the UK. Don't like posh cars, but now I might be able to buy half of a posh car. But, still, I think it's important to signal.
Some things are more about honor than perhaps the financial outcome here. You were talking about your free time, and I wanted to pick up on some of the other ventures you're going into. I've got a long list of them in front of me. Cage Cannabis, Better Choice, Slang Worldwide, DNA Genetics. But the one I wanted to touch upon is Mind Medicine Inc., just because the psychedelic movement, or at least the pioneers in it, remind me of perhaps cannabis 6 years ago, in that there's real science here, there's real stigma, but there's a lot of interesting business and product coming out of it. So I just wanted to allow you to plug it, I suppose, and tell me what you think about mind medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it was treated, all the psychedelics, and we're going to come up with a better framing word than psychedelics, because if you don't pick better words, you end up carrying the baggage you don't deserve. And so we're going to have a framing word that represents these, but they've all been treated as prohibitionist topics, where if asked in any government, why do you prohibit the use of ibogaine or psilocybin or, well, it's because we always have. And that argument is like, it's like dealing with a 3-year-old. And so I think those arguments fall down, and I'm going to be able to use a lot of the same logic of the arguments of why ignore when you can regulate, monetize, and educate. And the indications that I think some of the psychedelics may go against are competing with pharmaceutical products that are 35 years old, 25 years old. If you happen to have a kid or an adult with ADHD, the issue is you're dealing with, essentially an old drug. If someone's got a depressive...
Well, I challenge that. So you talked about using the same arguments as cannabis, but weren't the winning arguments in Canada, at least, keeping drugs out of the hands of children and drug money out of the hands of criminals? Now, for something like ibogaine, is that the same?
No, I would say that was the argument on turning it into a recreational product. But the first argument was that there's a clinical health benefit, and you can't withhold it from humans in Canada if there's an actual medical health. So I'm not trying to win an argument for adults to access on a recreational basis. I'm trying to win an argument so that these can actually be explored and turned into therapeutic treatments for people with depressive states, ADHD, a number of indications that potentially with the right delivery mechanisms, co-mingling with other active ingredients and clinical trials, could actually have therapeutic benefit to society. I'm not sure that these things, many of them actually have merit as a recreational product, but they certainly shouldn't be prohibited as a potential therapeutic process. And that's where I think the argument plus possible combinations, one of the things that MindMed did is to look at what's the hiccup, what's the rub? And with ibogaine, for example, it was the psychedelic effect. So the question was, well, could you alter the underlying ingredients such that you were able to have opioid weaning without the psychedelic effect, without the high? And we've prepared, initial indications are, yes, the amendments work, and that the product's prepared now to be into a phase 2 clinical trial, FDA structured, because if you alter or eliminate the psychedelic effect, you actually now have a different thing altogether, which may be governed more easily. And so that's the kind of area that I think it's worth just turning the rocks over and figuring out what's under them and doing it in a really orderly way. And part of my first, I should give a shout out, part of my first exposure to really thinking about this stuff was with the Beckley Foundation.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, Amanda and Cosmo, as I was naively entering the cannabis space with a purpose, these were people that I got to bump into, and they really opened my eyes about these things. And so I would say it's just a continuous journey of why try to ignore what might in fact be beneficial?
Well, I look forward to it reaching patients in the near future.
100%. Me as well. To move on to, I guess, another section of the discussion here, and perhaps it could almost frame it as a sort of agony aunt section. I know a lot of folks who are going to be listening to this pod will be really interested to hear a little bit of advice or sort of golden nuggets from you, Bruce. We touched upon before how you had grown Canopy Growth exponentially over the last 6 years. I guess a two-part question. What advice would you give to two segments of people? I guess A, startups who are looking to cut their teeth within this nascent industry, and B, CEOs of mid to large size firms who are really looking to take the next step with their business, perhaps drawing on how you scaled Canopy from 100 million market cap to 15 billion in really a relatively short period of time.
I guess there's 2 or 3 things that come to mind. I would say that many people, I have a lot of people on a daily basis pitch me, oh, you should be involved. And the pitches largely explain how they wish to benefit without really very much consideration to anyone else. Meaning, do you care where your jobs are located? Do you care how much risk and return you give your shareholders? Do you care that any of the people working for you have none of the equity because you don't believe in an options pool and a sharing program? When I ask them, you've got a facility now, where do people get their lunches? Do they make them all? How many microwaves do you have? How many fridges do you have? How do you make sure that the people working for you, have a pleasant place to actually come together and relax at their lunch? if I get a bunch of crappy answers there, what I hear is somebody who just wants to get rich quick. And I have no clue what is so enjoyable about getting rich quick, but there are quite a few people who in Canada and the US, not on the same dates, we have a Thanksgiving. I've explained many times, I said, if you invite a bunch of guests to your house for, it could be a Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving, and what you did is you cook what smells like a delicious meal, and you pull it from the oven, you carve the turkey, you prepare all of the everything. And what you do is then...
Oh, sorry, Bruce, there's a bit of a background.
That is a parrot.
Harboring some bats.
It's a parrot.
I was going to say, I was thinking, is that a parakeet or something?
It is a parrot who's somewhat pissed off. I'm talking, but not to him.
He's very intelligent. Could we rehear the bit on Thanksgiving?
So, yeah, maybe it was the talk of a bird being cooked, which I wouldn't mind with him. If what you do is after everyone's assembled, they smell what a great meal you've made, you then fill your plate, serve yourself, and say whatever's left you guys can have. That doesn't make you a particularly normal or good host in my books. And so I would say stop and make sure what your interest is in success for everyone, not you. Remember, our sector is entirely filled with retail shareholders, which means everyone's aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, moms and dads. You can't call them shareholders. You got to picture those people and why is it good for them? Because to them, maybe investing 2, 5, 10,000 is a big deal. And so you can't just say, well, it didn't work out great for the shareholders. No, it didn't work out great for somebody's aunts, uncles, moms and dads, brothers, sisters. So just stop and be sure that you're actually interested, want to do it, and that you're thinking about your shareholders, you're thinking about your communities, you're thinking about your teams. I keep seeing stuff where Mr. Branson, I think, has a phrase that says, it's actually not customers first, it's staff or employees first, because then they'll do a great job with customers. I agree with that, and I'd actually include, small retail shareholders. You got to think about all these other people first.
And so when you're being pitched these things, it looks like you've taken a fair spread of challenges on, even if you were free to pick up gas from Costco today. But I haven't seen anything from Europe. Are you going to step your toe over here or anything in the pipeline? I
have looked at a lot of things from Europe. There are two things that I'm in the sort of the final stages. I think some of the best scientific work with the best regulatory accelerating opportunities for, I don't care if you're looking at synthetics across the spectrum from cannabinoids to other therapeutics, or if you're looking at getting data and efficacy on four-legged mammals. I think Europe's going to be very central in creating not a growing platform for cannabis, maybe a little bit here or there, a bit of the bulk medicine, but I think actually thinking about what can this be and where can it be applied to various really curative outcomes. And so I'm very in the final stages of establishing a 100 million euro venture capital fund for tax or what other purposes located in Luxembourg, but functionally operated with key people that I've found in Paris and London. And we've already found our first investment. It comes out of Denmark. And so it's these sorts of things that will be really, I think, am I going to say, let's make a really good growing platform in Europe? Not really. People are a bit excited about Spain and Denmark and maybe some transformation of Dutch greenhouses, but I think using the ingredient intelligently and using academic platforms and research facilities in Europe will be a much more effective use of time and capital. And so that will, I suspect, be announced. We'll probably announce it in the first, maybe mid-January, but we've been doing all the legal document. And as I said, we've even made an investment.
Looking forward to the announcement.
Yeah. Well, and these are ones where you play a little longer, right? This is not, hey, how do we turn this into a 12-month win? This is how do we create things that don't even exist. When people talk about the size of the market, what this venture fund is investing in is things that aren't in the market because the illicit market hasn't created them yet.
So on the topic of Europe, what do you think European countries, their regulators, and as an extension of that, European investors could and can learn from Canada, the Canadian model, and the experiences of folks like yourself and businesses like the ones that you've been running in Canada for their own cannabis programs?
Well, we should keep it to some connection to geography. So I don't recall, what year did London host the Olympics?
2012,
I think.
And I believe they had a popular race called the 4x100 relay.
Yes.
Where I think they should look at investing as though they were participating in that relay. Do you really, when the baton is handing around the world from at least the first leg of the race to the second, meaning how do you produce cannabis? Is it better in a greenhouse? Is it better indoor? What are you doing with the basic genetics? How do you do basic extraction? If they want, they could start by investing in the first leg, knowing that everybody else has already run it. Or they could say, what happens in the second, third, and fourth legs? Because I think those races tend to not be won in the first leg. You can lose them, but you don't win. It's really what happens as the race progresses, and particularly the fourth leg. You typically, I think, like to see somebody who can do some pretty surprising things. So if I was an investor, I would say, well, have they really truly nailed extraction? Can they actually take all 100x cannabinoids and separate them? If they can't, maybe that's a smart thing to do, because you can do that with a lot of other high-end extraction. Can you prove what it does and how it does it and when it does it? Do you have your dosages figured out? Have the trials, the CROs, have they looked at whether or not this stuff actually has to stay by itself? Why are cannabinoids talked about as an isolated ingredient versus with other things? And so I would just simply, in the mindset, if I were directing investors, say, we're still in that race. Are we sure that we're actually investing representationally of the segment of the race we're at? And I'm seeing too many people pitching me on, oh, we're going to grow really cheap cannabis in Portugal and move it, or in somehow Malta and move it. And we're going to do what, if it became really cheap and moved everywhere, it's going to grow on the equator. It's growing on the equator in an area with really low labor rates. And then it's still going to be cheap, but it's not going to be shipped as that. It's going to be extracted into some, I'll call it heavy, basic extraction process, and probably shipped that way. Still hasn't created the maximum value. So I would be less excited about the first leg of the race than I think some people I'm seeing are.
So if we take extraction, interesting cannabinoid plus other active ingredient formulations as perhaps the second or third leg, has anyone pitched you a really out there fourth leg use for cannabis? Something that you just see it and say, whoa, it might not work, but it's balmy and I'm interested.
Yeah, so I have actually had a couple of folks who are like stem cell researchers who've actually said, we think if we could get enough of this type of cannabinoid, we think it might do these things to tumors. Okay, that's pretty out there, but like if the endocannabinoid system exists in our body, does it exist in the structural basic points that create our body? If it does, can you find some way to actually do something with those that actually could become curative? And maybe it's not on its own, but it's sort of like, you know, if you're trying to get an addict off of a alkaloid, early indications from our work are that if that person has an off-ramp of some other product plus they have cannabis, they actually have a higher success rate. I don't know where the collaborative efforts end, but I think they've barely begun.
Now, taking it on to a slightly different tack, I'm going to ask you a bit of a personal question. Two-part again. I do like a two-part question. Who in life would you say that you really admire? And as an extension of that, who in the cannabis industry that maybe perhaps you don't have a business connection to, would you say that you also admire?
You know, I think for a lot of people, it simply goes back. My mother was an extremely, and she's still with us, thankfully. She's not super well, but she was an extremely just and fair person, to the point that my brother, who's 2.5 years younger than me, was often mistaken as a twin with me because she didn't want to be unfair. So she bought us identical clothing. Now, and at Christmas, she would, before we opened stuff, confirm that within, 5 cents, 8 cents, 12 cents, she'd spent the exact same amount on both of us. So it was this whole idea of, and her license plate. So in Canada, you can now buy these vanity license plates. Hers is 2, the number, letter B, fair, to be fair. And it's not an opening line as a defense of something. It's actually her intent. And so that level of extremity definitely influenced my perspective on sharing with people. As far as the cannabis space, one of the first people that I wanted to have involved, who wouldn't be involved for the next 4 years really, was a guy named Dr. Mark Ware. And Dr. Ware, maybe a year and a half ago, joined Canopy after having spent 20 plus years doing what would have been crazy. He basically set up global cannabis networks for academics. He set up a capacity to do research in Canada. He was the regulatory advisor to Health Canada and many other governments. And he had a terrific academic background, but he brought it to bear on cannabis, where I would argue for at least 15 of the last 20 years, he wasn't particularly well received or popular. That's kind of interesting to me, and I respect it, because many people who become something of a notable title then want to work in the most popular space. And he didn't. And I think he made a global impact that probably isn't well recognized or appreciated at the level it should be.
And was his group of researchers academics, or was he going into the legacy or black market side of things?
Purely academic and looking at everything from, is there toxicity? What's the minimum dosage required? What indications could this go against? What do we need from a policy to have a supply chain so we can actually really do work? And so, he's been around. I would say he and his efforts sort of predate GW, and he knew those folks early through all the stuff that's happened back and forth with Israel, Canada. The guy is a global policy leader coming from a medical academic background, having been, at one of the best universities that was open to this in the world called McGill University. And so his contributions, it's sort of like the amount of glory given to the person who creates the phenomenal foundation in a building usually isn't appropriate. And so he's done a ton of work to create the foundations.
And I guess we have time for one last question, so we're going to make it count. Bruce, can you tell us something about you that none of your colleagues or perhaps ex-colleagues would know until they listen to this podcast?
Well, it might be towards a perception that somebody brought up yesterday that says, clearly you love doing media. And I said, well, actually, I respect media is a very tough job, right? Like if you don't do your job as a media person every day, it's evident to what would have been otherwise your viewer, listener, or reader. And probably your boss or your business model says that's over. But I don't actually do media for that reason. I do it because if you have something you want to achieve, the best platform is a microphone, either at the front of an audience or in front of a bigger audience, which is media. And if I did not have something I was trying to achieve, I would not come on your program to talk about a historic accomplishment because I think it's boring for me and other people. And so the perception that I actually do media just because I like it, no, I enjoy it, but it's with a purpose, which is to advance an objective or a range of businesses. And to some people, they'd be like, shut up, you just love wearing a t-shirt and promoting something. I said, no. I love to promote and explain stuff, and usually it takes a t-shirt because an infographic works. If you don't believe me, ask why Superman had an S on his chest.
So I want to steal that moment to turn this one last question into the second part of it. What do you think the objective that you most want to get out of this podcast is, and have you achieved it?
Well, I want people to actually understand that there's multiple waves coming and that I'm participating in them. So it's going to be whether it's through some of the ones you mentioned, Gage is a U.S. state. A better choice is going to change things for four-legged mammals, getting into mind medicine and what we're covering there. And I think people hopefully will be anticipating and quite eager once we launch our venture fund to say, I have a genius idea and I want you to look at it. And so, there has to be mutual benefit. And those are sort of the things that we checked off.
Well, that's a wonderful answer. And it's been a great podcast, and only slightly because I'm a fanboy. Bruce, thank you very much for being on our show.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys. Be good.
So, Johnny, I think with a guest like Bruce Linton, this episode may attract a few listeners who aren't our typical fare. So for those folks who are coming into this fresh-faced and unused to our dulcet tones, can you give them a little précis of what we're all about?
Yeah, 100%. Dulcet tones and whimsical intros aside, Professionally Cannabis is very much a podcast for entrepreneurs, connoisseurs, and those really interested in the cannabis industry. Each week in every episode, we like to interview real leaders and pioneers of the cannabis industry. Typically, these are founders and CEOs from many of the prominent and forward-looking cannabis companies in the world, but we also have a series of Professionally Cannabis meets, like this episode with Bruce Linton. We've had previous episodes with British members of parliament, and there will be many, many more to come.
Well, that's the info for our new listeners, and for our old listeners, thanks for coming once again. Like, subscribe, and do all that good stuff that makes our podcast happy. Take care, and bye-bye.
Love, please take me above. Take me with you.